of your drill bit is when you're in the ground. And besides the chemical revolution, the horizontal drilling revolution, it's really that knowing where you are that's the important thing. Because as soon as, in the old days, when a driller was going by his field and he got out of this source rock, he lost the ability to know whether or not he was even in that zone or not, and it was short-circuited, the well was a failure. So that's what this picture is, and the protection of sources of drinking water has been addressed for many years through the construction of wells. That continues to be the case. And our group has just finished a study with API collecting the literature of all of the studies, asking the question, what does the literature say about whether there's contamination of drinking water sources as a result of hydraulic fracturing? And none of them identify any effect. The one study that does have an effect is at the surface. And it was a case where the hydraulic fracturing was occurring here. There was another well right nearby, and the fluids went from this well straight up through the old well to the surface. So it was a surface spill, which is something that's part of the industrial activity of oil and gas. So in the discussions that we have surrounding the environmental effects, there's always this, are we talking about hydraulic fracturing specifically, or are we talking about oil and gas in general? And that question of the effect on drinking water sources is one in which that is particularly complicated. With respect to hydraulic fracturing alone, you don't see an effect. With respect to surface operations of oil and gas, you do see effects. You have seen them since oil and gas production began, and there's protections to address those. Okay, the next question we're addressing here is chemical migration. And this is a map of my hometown, Los Angeles, and the yellow is the outlines of the city of Los Angeles, and these purples are areas where we know that there's naturally high levels of methane, and the building codes require that you account for that. The reason that methane is there is because the Los Angeles basin worldwide is the richest accumulation of oil and gas. And when you have that much oil and gas in this concentrated an area, you have methane at the surface. So this is something that we see in Pennsylvania, we see in areas where you have these particularly thick accumulations of oil and gas. The question of migration and hydraulic fracturing surrounds the overpressure that you do in order to fracture the rocks. So when you're doing that, if you remember the cross-section, we're at about 2 miles depth, sometimes as shallow as a mile. And the fracturing process itself takes anywhere from about an hour to 2 hours. After that, the well goes on to production, and the sense of direction is the opposite. Instead of pressure outwards to fracture the rocks, you're pumping, and so you're trying to create a vacuum to draw the oil and gas out. So for chemical migration to occur, you've got about 2 hours. And things in rock tend not to move very far within a 2-hour period. So chemical migration is severely limited by the geological process when you're talking about hydraulic fracturing. Another aspect of chemical migration are the chemicals that are used themselves. And this was a place where in New York, the use of proprietary formulations and the resistance to disclosing the compositions really worked against the industry strongly. And there was just a report out today in Los Angeles talking about the risks of cristobalite, which is widely used in hydraulic fracturing. The report went on to also call it crystalline silica. It stopped short of calling it sand, which is pretty prevalent in Los Angeles on our beaches, but there you have it. It's a fairly easy thing to incite fear in people. Cristobalite sounds like some glowing radioactive thing you'd find in a Brazilian landfill, but it's not, it's sand. Okay, so produced water management is the next topic, and I mentioned its prevalence. And the volumes that you produce, that's too fast. Okay, there you go. The volumes that we produce are much larger than what you can inject back into these shale formations. You know, the permeability of that shale is what you have created, and you're trying to extract from that. So the last thing you want to do is re-inject. And so that of the unconventional production of oil and gas, that is one of the major issues. And the moves towards resolution of that now include trying to reclassify this as not so much a waste as, if treated properly to meet objectives, water quality objectives, how can you beneficially use it? And in dry parts of the world, this is really the direction we're headed. It's not just treating it so that you can use it for your next hydraulic fracture. That's pretty well understood and generally applied in the more mature areas of this type of development. But it's another step to use it for, say, wash down water for industrial purposes. I've done a study where it's used to re-inject into groundwater that's used for irrigation. In Colorado, some of this treated water to drinking water standards is placed back into the Colorado River, and you get a credit in that over-allocated system. So this is an area of produced water management, very active research, and there's a lot going on here. This picture, by the way, is in Sumatra in Indonesia, where they release the produced water directly to the streams. This is a little pump that this tea house uses to pump this relatively hot produced water up there. The tea has a little tang of arsenic to it, but it's actually very interesting flavor, I gotta say. Induced seismicity, I don't want to, this is a big thing. So this again is one of these cross sections. I warned you. You guys show me all these models and the exogenous factors. I'm going to show you cross sections. So this is the ground surface at this oil and gas field in the middle of Los Angeles. That's La Cienega for those of you who have driven to LAX. And then each one of these little pages of a book is a different geological strata. And down here at about 8,500 feet, about a mile and a half, is where the hydraulic fractures that we studied were done. That is the results, those little spheres are the results of microseismic monitoring. The induced seismicity when you fracture is very, very feeble. On the magnitude scale of earthquakes, where Chile regularly has magnitude 8, we're pretty used to magnitude 6. These are, and if there was an earthquake here, maybe due to post-glacial rebound, about half of you would feel one at magnitude 2. These are at magnitude -2 to -3. So about 100,000 times less than one that half of us might feel. All of the studies that have been done by the USGS, the Natural Resources Council, conclude that those types of pressures are insufficient to induce tectonic quakes, those that cause damage. In this area that we studied, those quakes would occur. Here's our hydraulic fracturing. The tectonic quakes would, can you see that little red dot? No, not in the back. About 6 miles down is where the quakes in LA tend to originate. Another thing that we did in our study was measure vibration at the surface during these 2 hydraulic fractures. All of these studies, we had about a year of before data, measurement during the hydraulic fracture, and a year afterwards. In some cases, it's ongoing. And for the vibration monitoring, during the before period, we could detect a big truck when the hydraulic fracture vehicles were driving in. We saw that signal. But the hydraulic fractures themselves did not produce any vibration detectable at the surface. When you measure these really feeble ones, your geophones that actually record, you have to put down in another deep well near where you're hydraulic fracturing in order to even detect it. Finally, in looking at this question, we worked with Caltech to, as an MIT guy, it was pretty difficult for me to make that phone call, but they run the seismic network in Southern California, and we had them put an accelerometer at our field, and throughout this 2-year period, they haven't detected anything related to either the hydraulic fracturing or the oil and gas production that goes on here. Of course, we do see induced seismicity, but it has been linked to produced water injection. But it's not all the time. This vertical piece right here, that is the Newport-Inglewood Fault. It bisects this field. It is overdue since about 1970 for its big 7.4 magnitude quake. During that period, when it's been overdue, there's been a water flood, injection of water at this field going on. So in this case, you're near you're bisected by one of the most active faults in Los Angeles, and you've been pumping water 24/7 for 40 years, and there's been nothing occurring. So it doesn't occur everywhere, but under some conditions, the injection, long-term injection of water does lead to some induced seismicity. And in those states where that is particularly of concern, Oklahoma was mentioned earlier, that's one of the directions of regulatory connection. So the last thing I want to talk about is this question of community compatibility or social license to operate. This, among the males here, she needs no introduction. Daryl Hannah, we fell in love with her as a mermaid. And this was a project that I had for an LNG import terminal in Los Angeles. We had the ideal spot. We had a lot of support from the local community, from the government agencies. And then at the end, the one thing that, I don't know why we didn't realize it, but we were just offshore of Malibu. And so this was a paddle out where Daryl brought her pink surfboard and many of her friends to paddle. It was 14 miles out to the site. They didn't make it. But the reason here I put this here is that killed the project, and so in developing the social license to operate, the key is to communicate early and often. And by the time this was occurring, we had not communicated as regularly as we should have. And this carried the day. I made this point in speaking in Australia, and a professor at the University of Victoria developed this graph. It's kind of difficult to work out here, but it links sort of the world of calculated risks and studies, things like that, and those can lead to your brain. And what he classified as good policy. And then there's this political risk and perceived risk. Really, what is the public afraid of? How does that drive the political process? And then here's our pink surfboard, and a little shortcut to public opinion. And his point here is the point I make, that really if you're trying to get into this zone of social license to operate, some acceptability of the project, you really need to work with that and to address it, to listen to the concerns and answer the questions. We're going to skip that. And so it is something that we are trying to study. This is one of the more qualitative ones. But in the area where your project, you haven't communicated enough to develop legitimacy, you don't get approvals, you get bans, you get moratoria. And some of the benefits of the shale boom that we've been hearing throughout the last day and a half don't make it to the people I talk to. In 2 weeks I'm flying to Western Australia, and the traditional owners I'm working with there, the Aborigines, they don't know about the economic benefits, but they know about what they are told that comes from the internet that scares them. And so there's this, that hasn't crossed the legitimacy boundary. There's a credibility boundary, at least where what you're saying is believed or at least gains some airspace. And then that's when you can get to at least acceptance of projects. And so we see that in much of the country, but certainly not all of it. And then, we're not quite at the approval or even psychological identification. I love this project and I'm going to be part of it, unless you have one or two or a few landowners who are directly benefiting. And then this is where we wind up with regulatory drift and uncertainty. And this externality of environmental is really one of the major issues that leads to questioning whether the boom we have going now is sustainable here in this country, and certainly whether or not it would have international acceptability. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
Wow, thanks to all three of our speakers. It isn't often I sit and take notes and learn stuff, but I found this truly helpful. We've got some time for questions. If anyone would like to come, I'm going to use a chairman's prerogative and talk a little bit about some other factors that I didn't hear mentioned. In particular, markets and the way in which North America operates its gas market in particular is unique globally. We have no, I think some people mentioned, some of the major players. Ed certainly, mentioned some major global players that serve it. But in fact, we can always sell the flow over a 2-hour period, whatever it is that Dan mentions. Following this, there's a good deal of production, and production changes. We use the market, to accommodate changes in production. You can always sell the gas in the market. You may not always like the price you get, but you'll always be able to sell it. There's no question that you can get rid of the volumes. In Poland, for example, it's not necessarily clear. You've got to have a particular buyer. There is one buyer, and if the buyer's not taking that day, you're not going to be able to dispose of it. So I just wondering if there's just a quick thought on this. I think, for example, the UK is one industry that does operate the way the North Americans operate, with a market-based open access pipeline system. So is there a leg up that the UK has? Maybe Syria or...
So I'd suggest that the markets certainly played a big role over here, but in a country like China or Argentina, where you might not have that kind of a market, you do still have a regulatory structure that's very pragmatic. If they decide that they want this to happen, they can find ways to make it happen. So you don't really need rigorous sort of market structures, what I would suggest.
Okay, good. We have a tour Thursday morning with NYMEX, the floor of NYMEX, and this has really been instrumental in my view in making it happen here. Okay.
I'm Andrew Slaughter.
Hi, Andrew.
The shale gas and tide oil and tide rock phenomenon have been driven by technology or combinations of technologies. I'd like to get some insights into where you think technology is going and what kind of improvements we might get in both the extent and the duration of the shale and tide.
Dan? Sorry, I was just going to jump in.
Okay, sure.
So, from the environmental perspective, a lot of the focus of new technology and developments has to do with the fluids that are used for the fracturing itself. Initially, just historically, water and sand had been the fluids of choice, and then different additives had been brought in order to improve the ability of that water plus sand mixture to get out 1,000, 2,000 feet away from the well and prop open those fractures. So that's been where a lot of the early technology development's been. Now, with environmental concerns related to the use of water, concerns related to the particular chemicals that are used. There's a lot of efforts to use things other than water and to improve the environmental friendliness of some of the chemicals. Where the communities I speak to, that last part is always a hard argument. You know, I spoke to a group a bit larger than this, and it was one where plainclothes policemen with guns were replaced because of all the threats that were there. And for the first and only time, I said that, you know, guar gum is used in frozen yogurt, and it's true. It's used in hydraulic fracturing too. But I got so many eye rolls, and you know, that just sometimes the truth can be counterproductive. So, but anyway, I think that's where I see a lot of the new technology has to do with the fluids that are used.
So Andrew, you mentioned that technology has played a large role in making all this happen, and it's absolutely true. Like when we talk about unconventional gas, the gas molecule is exactly identical to conventional gas. It's the rock that is uncooperative, right? And it is technology and the needs, the economics that drove all this innovation. So we talked about men being able to log while drilling and be able to know where exactly the drill bit is in order to accurately drill and unlock these reserves, which we used to know about them. We always call them uneconomic resources. Now, before I talk about the future of shale gas and the role of technology in there, let me paint a picture for you. So I heard this on TV. You're in New York City. You've heard about, if you haven't seen it, you've heard about the Empire State Building. Visualize 12 Empire State Buildings stacked one on top of the other. Water and rock all the way down to the ground. You're trying to drill down, make your way all across Central Park, the extent of a very large park. You are aiming for a car parked at the other side, go through the driver's side window, hit a target about the size of a dinner plate, smaller than a steering wheel. That's the sort of technology you took to drill the relief well for the Gulf of Mexico Macondo spill. That's the kind of technology that the oil field commands, brings to the table. You don't hear about it very much because you don't have the photo ops of a moon landing, and people say it's not rocket science. It is rocket science. Think about it. You can't see what's going on. You have all this instrumentation. You're flying blind, and you're hitting that one dinner plate in that one car parked across Central Park, going from 12 Empire State Buildings high. So now coming back to the question. Yeah, as price pressures increase, oil and gas companies are demanding much more innovation. They're demanding reduction in prices, in costs, I'm sorry. So if service companies like Baker Hughes can bring those costs down, that unlocks much more of those reserves. Marginal resources become economic all of a sudden. As demand grows, prices go up. You will continue to see innovations. I mean, some of these are going to be driven by economics, some of these are going to be driven by environmental reasons. So there is no step change here. It's a continuum. It just keeps going on and on. And as I mentioned in my original talk, along the way you could see a disruptive change that could make all this irrelevant. You might not be pursuing shale gas anymore or shale oil.
Interesting.
So, my name is Eugene Biotofe. Just want to ask a question for Dr. Dan. I quite impressed with the presentation, but I want to ask a question on a part of the consideration for fingerprinting method. I'm aware that fingerprinting method is one of the methods you use for environmental monitoring and assessment. I just want to know how is it related to the hydrofraction. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And could you repeat the monitoring method? I didn't quite get that.
Fingerprinting,
Oh, wow.
which is number 2 of your consideration.
Yes.
Method, yeah. So if we can go through the slide again.
Certainly, yes. Thank you. Yeah, so fingerprinting is, the geologist's attempt, the geochemist's attempt to have sort of a forensic analysis, and it is, so for methane, you frequently run against the question, is the methane that I'm detecting in the body of this building as a result of the oil and gas development, or is it due to something else? And we managed to get through this whole panel without mentioning Gasland, but I think for this question you do have to use that because the iconic picture of the flaming faucet led to this question of is that because of the oil and gas development? And in many of the areas there was no data before that faucet was lit on fire. And so fingerprinting became one of the tools to answer the question of whether this is a background or whether this is oil and gas development related. And owing to the way that methane forms, sometimes it forms in sewer pipes, and when those sewer pipes crack, you get a release of shallow methane. When you are building and you bury some wetlands in order to do that, the organic material decays and it forms methane. It's called swamp gas. And then when you take organics and you put them 2 miles down and you fold them and you crush them and you heat them up, you get another kind of methane that's formed that we call natural gas. Each one of those has a distinctive composition that you can measure, and that by using where your measurement falls, you can, in the field of those distinctive compositions, you can definitively state, this is swamp gas. This is not from oil and gas development. Where that fingerprinting analysis for methane gets challenged is in an area like Los Angeles, an area like Western Pennsylvania, where there is a lot of that natural gas that has the characteristics of having been heated and put to high pressure. And it naturally occurs. If you went there 1,000 years ago, it would be that natural gas would be at shallow levels. So fingerprinting, like any forensic analysis, gives you one line of evidence, but when you're searching for sources, sometimes that one line of evidence is definitive. Other times you need to develop kind of a weighted evidence argument and augment the fingerprinting.
Thank you. My name is Ilhan Or.
Before you a moment. So the fiery faucet in the movie, where was that?
That was, well, there's been several fiery faucets. There's been one in the Powder River Basin of Colorado. There's been one in Western Pennsylvania. They haven't, I don't know why, they haven't done one in California. It would be pretty easy. Well, I know why. All of our water comes from the Colorado River or from the Delta. The water comes from 700 miles away from the city. So that's why.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ilhan Or from the Turkish affiliate. I would like to thank all presenters, first of all, and the chair for a very, very interesting and illuminating session. For my part, I learned a lot, not only the ingredients of the American Revolution, but how it can be projected to the world, and also a good representation of the perception of the risks involved. So what I see, the American Revolution cannot be replicated immediately, but in a decade or so, it's very much probable that it will be replicated all around the world. Now the issue is, a decade is a very, very short time in energy issues. you plan a nuclear plant, not that I'm advocating nuclear plants, but you plan a plant, it will get operational in 15 years. So to make a comparison, the likelihood of getting nuclear power from this day on, sometime in the future, in 15 years, is probably less than the likelihood of the shale revolution being replicated all around the world. Given that background, my question is, since everybody knows that shale revolution will very much be replicated all around the world in 15 years or so, what will be the impacts of this information on carbon and non-carbon other sources, on the technologies being developed, on investments being made, both in carbon. I mean, what will some Middle Eastern oil-rich countries will think about when they see that they will have this high competition on the over the horizon in 15 years? What will be the effect of flooding the market and so on and so forth in the meantime? And what will be the impacts on renewable sources or other sources as well? I know it's not an easy question to answer, but I think this is something that we should all be thinking about. Thank you.
Ilhan, you know, I think that this is probably a great theme for the conference that I know you were planning in Turkey, which will take place next year. You effectively stated the challenge, and very well so, very well done so, I can say. So anyone would like to, pick up on Ilhan's thoughts.
Well, I would like to add, or I'd like to pick up on the question of the non-carbon sources. In my remarks that were pretty focused on the concerns that are here in the United States, I kind of classify them, and I'm probably biased, but as fear-based concerns, that as you line them up and analyze them, you find that there's not cause, certainly for the level of fear that these provoke. But when I work in other countries, and I notice it most in Australia, the debate is more centered around if we develop and burn these sources of natural gas, it's not really a transitional fuel anymore. It's the transition to a renewable future. It's the fuel. And what does that mean for the treaty obligations that we've signed? And so the debate tends to be more around carbon versus non-carbon sources of power. And that is I see that just starting really over the last year in the United States. And to me, that's where the debate needs to be. We're chasing after all these little red herrings that are very fear-based, when really there's a fundamental question as a society we need to grapple with. And so I think, maybe for when your conference is started in Turkey, that could be one of the themes, because it's a difficult question. It's an extremely complicated question, but it's the question in my mind.
I'd like to elaborate on just a couple of points. We're dealing with a phenomenon that nobody predicted, neither in its occurrence, nor in its extent, nor in its depth. We're dealing with technology in part, but we're dealing with innovation. We're dealing with dislocations and discontinuities. And there's nothing like this shale revolution that has started, and to use the baseball analogy that a senior executive at both an oil company and a competitor Baker uses said, we're sort of at the first half of the first inning in terms of technological change and understanding of exploitation. But it is a discontinuity to the degree that we can think about some things that are likely to unfold. The power generating sector is quite different from the transportation fuel sector. It's the sector where we tend to think about more of sustainable development of non-carbon-based sources for fuel. And while we're only in the very beginning of renewables, at the very beginning large storage technology. It's clear that the utility model that exists in advanced economies and emerging markets is broken and won't work. It will be a significant political issue. It's already a political issue, more in Europe than the US, where you have in Europe lower demand for power and more distributed energy coming from more renewables. Renewables tend to be used at the peak electricity usage time, noon, middle of the day when you've got more sunlight, and you combine wind and solar. And that's the time when utilities generally, historically, have charged the most for power because of peak reasons. And we're now seeing in some countries in Europe even more than 60% of base load in the middle of the day coming from renewables. So it's a challenge not just on the technology side, but it's a challenge in terms of public understanding and public management of the most important of all primary energy sources in electricity.
I get concerned when people channel gas. Market channeling is fundamentally, disruptive. It's kind of deciding, with the market. That's tempting. In the case of natural gas, you could say to the extent gas is replacing coal, which we are doing in the United States, that is a major growth market, then of course it's an enormous carbon positive. In fact, it's more than just half. Chemically, gas is half the carbon, produces half carbon dioxide. The fact is the gas producing, power producing machines with gas combined cycle combustion turbines are far more efficient than oil-fired power plants that they're replacing. So the actual carbon drop is 70%, not 50%, when old coal is replaced with new gas. On the other hand, you can have the most efficient gas generation. There is high efficiency combined cycle combustion turbine, and replace nuclear with it, and it's still adding, to carbon. To the extent we replace, gasoline with natural gas, or gasoline with electricity produced from natural gas, it's carbon plus. So it's kind of tempting to do this. Sit down and be the emperor and say this is where gas should be used. It's tempting, but the fact is, I don't think the market necessarily, will do that. So just, on this thought, gas. I've always thought from my whole career that the notion of gas is not a renewable fuel. I think it is a renewable fuel. It's probably part of the Earth's composition. I know gold decades ago tried to, drill in Sweden or something. It didn't work. That in fact, gas is everywhere. But that said, it's still a carbon fuel, and so at some point, we really need to weave in, the renewables, other renewables, non-carbon renewables, I should say, in order to meet our global warming goals. Okay, I think that is fundamentally it for our panel. Thank you so much. Let us please join me. I understand we're having a quick coffee break at this point.
Thank you.
Scale operations.